Al Jazeera Podcasts.
Hey everyone, Malika here. Before we get to today's episode, just to note that my conversation was recorded before the announcement of a ceasefire between Israel and Hamas. Today, when trauma becomes a weapon.
This is a very emotional issue. It's not about intellectual facts or historical facts or debates about realities.
Renowned doctor and author Gabor Maté's journey from embracing Zionism to rejecting it, and what his work tells us about trauma as a driving force for violence. I'm Malika Bilal, and this is The Take.
My name is Gabor Maté. I'm a retired physician, author of 5 books published in over 40 languages, and I do a lot of speaking internationally on issues of health, body and mind unity, stress, child development, addiction, and trauma. I also speak on the Israel-Palestine issue, which is very close to my heart.
Well, Dr. Maté, it is so good to have you on The Take. You've been all over all of my social feeds on all of those topics, but today we're going to be talking about that last one. You are a Holocaust survivor, born in Hungary, and later, growing up in Canada, you became a Zionist. In your work, you explore the many ways that trauma can shape an individual and society. And I want to start with how that's played out in your own life. How do you think the trauma of your family's history influenced your life and your earlier beliefs about Zionism?
Well, so I was an infant in 1944 when the Nazis occupied Hungary. So I spent the first year of my life under Nazi occupation during the genocide of Hungarian Jews, where over 500,000 people were sent to their deaths within a space of 3 or 4 months. The rest of that year were spent much of it under a very vicious anti-Semitic Nazi-like government in Hungary. My mother and I barely survived. My father was in forced labor, and my grandparents died in Auschwitz. Now, the stress of that first year, and then forced separation from my mother when I was 11 months of age, all of that had a huge impact on the development of my personality. It also gave me a sense of how precarious it is to be a Jew in Eastern Europe. And that had a huge impact on my not compulsion, but my call towards Zionism later on, because Zionism appeared to me as a teenager here in Canada as the perfect answer to that horrific history. It was like a redemption, a regaining of power, an assertion of a positive, proud Jewish identity, and really an antidote to hundreds of years of persecution.
Well, first of all, I'm so sorry to have you retell that story and for what you lived through. There's a painting by your wife that I'm looking at here on my screen, and it's a photo of you at about 3 months old with your mother under Nazi occupation. So it's a painting of a picture. Your mother's wearing the mandated yellow star. What do you recall looking back now about that picture? What does it make you feel now? What can you tell us?
So the painting by my wife, she did that because she wanted to understand her husband. And it's the actual photograph itself. And that was taken by a neighbor. And the neighbor says, "Why do you want to wear this badge of shame for this photograph?" And my mother said, "If my son survives, I want him to see what happened." In the photograph itself, and it's very well captured by my wife in her painting, that's not the eyes of a 3-month-old. Those are the eyes of an old person. There's a little depth of sadness in that photograph, and I've carried that all my life. And so that affected my life in multiple ways. When I look at it now, 2 things come up. One is that no infant should have to go through that. And that includes the infants in Gaza who are suffering this bombing and these deaths and the loss of their parents and this deprivation. The other is something about the goodness of life, because I did survive, and I survived due to the love of my mother, the love even of strangers without going to the whole history. So that photograph brings up for me both sorrow but also gratitude.
And what an act of love by your wife to take that on to better understand you. Thank you for sharing that. You said you used to think about Zionism as an antidote to the years of persecution. But over time, you later came to reject Zionism. You've been a very vocal critic of Israel's policies from long before October 7th, 2023. Can you take me through that transformation? What did you learn that changed your mind?
I learned reality. I learned history. In the Zionist movement, you get a certain view of history, which basically is one of suffering, redemption, and triumph of the Jewish people. But you never hear that in that land where this redemption and supposed triumph took place, there was another people connected to the land who had to be displaced and suppressed and denied their rights for the Zionist movement to achieve its goal. And that reality is not retrospective. That was known all along, so that Zionism necessarily made a decision that our suffering justifies the suffering of another people. And that has had horrific consequences on the Palestinians. It has also had consequences on the Jewish people that I think are lamentable. And interestingly enough, those consequences were foreseen right from the beginning. So the whole idea that Jewishness is identified with Zionism was never true. There was always prominent Jews, visionary Jews who didn't accept Zionism for its corrupting influence on the Jewish soul. And unfortunately, everything they predicted has come true.
Do you remember the moment for you, though, that let's call it an epiphany, came to be?
Well, there's no moment. It was a process. The process began with when I was in the Zionist movement, and I was the leader of a local Zionist group. But at some point, for a conference, I was given the task of how do we counter Arab propaganda on the campuses. I'm talking in the early 1960s here.
Wow. It sounds so similar to what we're hearing right now.
Yeah, and
2024, 25.
Oh, yeah, it hasn't changed. And so I thought, well, it might be an idea to find out what the Arab propaganda is. So I started looking into it a bit more deeply. And that's when I began to discover all these other sources, these non-Zionist Jewish sources that had critiqued the movement all along. So that was the first impetus. And then more specifically, in 1967, when that war broke out, and it was presented as Israel's response to Arab aggression. And by that time, the Vietnam War was going on. And in the Vietnam War, which to many people living today, that seems like ancient history. But what was happening is that the Americans were bombing and napalming and chemically destroying a whole country and killing millions of people. And the media and the press were lying about it and denying the truth of it. And when I saw in 67 that the same media was all of a sudden cheerleading Israel's attack in June on Egypt and the other Arab countries.
For the third time since its birth as an independent state, Israel is embroiled in a war with the Arab nations that surround her. Her forces are outnumbered 2-1.
I thought, well, why would the same media that denies the massacre of the Vietnamese be so committed to supporting Israel? So I began to have serious doubts, and that's when I did the research. And by fall of that year, I concluded that that war, 67 war, had been fought as a war of expansion and as a war of extending the Zionist project. And that's when I deeply looked into the history of Zionism. So I wouldn't say there was one moment of epiphany. It was more like a process of gradually waking up to reality, just as many Jews are waking up these days, based on what they're seeing in Gaza and the West Bank.
Well, I want to hover on these days because we've talked quite a bit here at The Take about the trauma of Palestinians, but Israel has also invoked trauma to justify its war on Gaza, the trauma of the Holocaust, the trauma of the October 7th attack itself are what often get referenced.
The savagery that we witnessed perpetrated by the Hamas murderers coming out of Gaza were the worst crimes committed against Jews since the Holocaust.
How do you understand the role of trauma in Zionism historically and in Israel's current war on Gaza?
Well, there's no question that the Zionist movement found its major impetus in the trauma of Eastern European Jews in the late 19th, early 20th centuries, where there were terrible persecutions. Then, of course, the unspeakable horror of the Nazi genocide, which, from one point of view, perfectly justified the Zionist perspective that as long as we don't have our own land and our own country and our own army, we're going to be helpless victims of the world. Many of the people on the Jewish side who fought in the war in 1948, what the Palestinians experienced as the Nakba, the disaster, the catastrophe, and Israel considers to be its war of independence. Many of the people fighting in that war on the Jewish side were themselves escapees, refugees from terrible persecution in Eastern Europe. And to them, the Arabs fighting against them were just another set of enemies that wanted to destroy the Jews, which explains some of the horrible cruelty that they practiced upon the Palestinians. Cruelty that has now been uncovered, documented by Israeli historians, but which is rarely ever talked about. And then from that perspective, if you don't know the history, if you don't know any of that, which many people don't because we have a very narrow, selective, and ethnocentric view of history, not just Jews, most people around the world, then October the 7th just seems like another anti-Semitic outrage. And it triggers all that other trauma. And of course, the event itself, with the death of civilians or soldiers for that matter, was traumatic for a lot of Israelis and Jews around the world. So trauma plays a huge role here in shaping the Jewish consciousness. It's not the only factor, and it's not the only important factor, but from the emotional point of view, certainly it is a powerful one.
Yeah. I think what you're saying is why we heard things like this is the worst attack on Jews since the Holocaust, framing it as though this was an attack on Jews versus an attack on a state and state actors and people in that state.
Yeah, and you know, that's just the misuse and the abuse and the exploitation, I think very cynical one, of Jewish trauma. Because that wasn't an attack on Jews. That was without justifying the specific events of October 7th, or some of them, or many of them, that was an eruption against an occupation and a siege. And it wasn't targeted at Jews because they were Jews. It was targeted against an occupying power.
More with Gabor Maté after the break. Dr. Maté, you've talked in the past about a mythology around this trauma and how it shows up today. So the idea that in the Holocaust, Jews should have fought back, even though there were people fighting back at that time. Can you walk me through that thinking?
That critique of Eastern European Jews for not fighting back is actually a Zionist propaganda point. The Zionists were terribly dismissive and contemptuous of Eastern European Jews, some of the Zionist leaders. First of all, there was Jewish resistance to the Nazi genocide. There was the incredibly brave and transcendently inspiring revolt in the Warsaw Ghetto, in other ghettos as well, by people that were barely armed against the most powerful military machine in the world, and they fought back as best they could. And secondly, it's very easy to criticize people who've been rendered powerless over time, who've been marginalized. Exactly how was my mother going to fight back against the Nazis with a 3-month-old infant? What was she going to do? So to accuse them of cowardice or weakness is just a slander. And it's a very cynical one, I think.
Your views have made you very popular in some circles and very unpopular in some others, and you don't shy away from confronting that latter circle. So there's a clip that went viral of you interacting with an audience member at a speech that you gave last October here in California, where I am. And in it, the audience member repeats some now debunked claims about the Hamas attack in 2023.
We are approaching October 7th.
Yeah.
When the horrible massacre happened in Israel.
Yeah.
Where young children were murdered, burned, babies in ovens.
That didn't happen. There were no babies in ovens.
Oh, yes, they were.
No, there weren't. That's been refuted even by the Israelis.
And she asks, how do I find compassion for the animals that did that? Your response was sharp and incisive. Can you tell me how you answer these questions?
I know people really like my answer and so on, but if I were to do it again, I'd do it differently.
How so?
I'd ask her, do you really want to find compassion? I actually got into a bit of a interaction with her. I wouldn't anymore. I would actually speak with her much more directly and say, well, what is your actual intention here? If you really want compassion, stop talking about them as animals. If what you want to do is express your rage and your anger, I hear you. Basically, what I want to say to those people is, are you sure you know what you're talking about? I mean, do you really want to know? Because if you want to know, you can find out. These days, if you don't know, it's because you're so committed to your point of view that it excludes any information that in any way would weaken or undermine or even counter your point of view. Like I said to this woman in Anaheim, California, they live in a bubble. And from that point of view, when they hear somebody like me speaking, either I'm totally ignorant, or I'm a sellout, or a traitor, or insane. You know? See, this is a very emotional issue. It's not about intellectual facts or historical facts or debates about realities. These positions are held more from an unconscious emotional commitment, a kind of identification. And it's very difficult for people to let go of their emotional identifications. Those of us Jews that are speaking that way just are too threatening to the self-image of people who are identifying with Israel and Zionism as the expression of Jewishness. So they can't dare allow themselves to look at the actual realities that we're trying to bring to their attention. I understand that. What's interesting is that as we move further generationally, as we move further away from the Nazi Holocaust, younger generations are much more open. So that if you look at many of the campus protesters, they were Jews.
Right.
They were less impacted by the horrors of what happened in the 1940s in Europe. So they're a bit more at liberty to look at reality without that heaviness of that emotional burden. So it's as much of an emotional and psychological issue as it is a political one.
So I want to tap into your expertise here as a trauma expert.
Okay.
Aside from the rhetoric, we've also seen people who are celebrating and glorifying what's been happening in Gaza. So videos, for example, of Israeli soldiers mocking Palestinians, wearing their clothes, making light of blowing up homes. How do you make sense of that behavior?
Number one, if you talk to any Israelis with consciousness and conscience, they will tell you how essentially it's a country that trains its kids to be prepared to fight the Palestinians and to regard them as less than human, right from the beginning. And this is true of any colonial people. Whenever you come into a country and you have to dominate the indigenous population, you have to see them as less than human. And that's not unique to Israel, Palestine. Then there's the shock of October the 7th. I'm not just talking about the genuine grief that a lot of people would have experienced after the October 7th and the deaths of all those people. It was a huge blow to the Israeli ego that these guys on motorcycles and bicycles and armed with rifles came in and they were so effective. That's a huge blow to the Israeli ego, as we're the most powerful army and we're the best army and so on. So there's a significant element of humiliation that the Israelis suffered that day and the desire for revenge. So what we're seeing here in those horrifying, mocking, inhumane TikTok segments is both the results of a lifelong indoctrination and an untrammeled desire for revenge. We're going to show you who's in charge.
Well, finally, Dr. Maté, we're talking in the second week of January. And as we speak, it sounds like there might be a breakthrough in ceasefire talks. Though, of course, we have heard that before. If and when that ceasefire comes, from a trauma perspective, what will you be thinking about the next day?
Well, I'll be remembering all the studies that were done on Palestinian children decades ago about how traumatized they already were decades ago. And they have to multiply it by 1,000. So I'm thinking of the future of what these kids will have to live through and how that whole people will even rise themselves from the ashes and the rubbles. I mean, think of Los Angeles multiplied by 1,000,000. That's the first thing I'll be thinking about. I'll be thinking about, well, those Israelis, and there are some very brave ones, very forthright ones, who are trying to infuse some sanity and some conscience into the awareness of their people. Will they find their voices? And will they find some listening? That's the second thing I'll be thinking about. The third thing is rather not cynical, but realistic. There have been ceasefires between Hamas and the Palestinians in general on the one hand and Israel on the other. If you actually look at the history, if you look at the research of somebody like Dr. Norman Finkelstein and others, those ceasefires were broken almost every time by the Israelis. And then the Palestinian response was seen as the aggression. So as long as the Zionist project of making that whole land Jewish, as long as that project continues, any ceasefire is going to be a temporary respite from a very tragic conflict.
Dr. Maté, thank you so much for this conversation and for giving us a window into why we keep seeing what we keep seeing. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Before we go, Malika here. I've got some news. I'm going on parental leave, off to have a baby, so I'm handing the mic to a slate of guest hosts you already know well. I'll be back on the mic this summer, though you may still hear my voice and see my face here and there on some episodes. I'll see you soon.